So it wasn't just numbers on a ledger. It had real consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely devastating consequences in many cases.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. How did these colossal transfers from India fit into the bigger picture, the story of global capitalism's development? It sounds like they weren't just incidental, but pretty fundamental.
Oh, completely fundamental. You can't really understand the rise of global capitalism, particularly Britain's role in it, without understanding these transfers. Essentially, this flow of wealth, whether as direct revenue or through these complex financial mechanisms, allowed colonizing powers, especially Britain, to import far more goods, raw materials, food, than they could have possibly afforded based on their own export earnings alone.
So India was effectively subsidizing British consumption and investment.
Subsidizing British consumption, British investment, and fueling the massive expansion of global trade networks in the 19th century. Britain became this central hub, this major market and leading creditor, largely facilitated by this resource flow from its colonies, especially India.
And India's role went beyond just being a source of raw materials and a captive market for British goods, didn't it? There was more to it.
Much more. Economic historians like Saul, Hilgert, they've shown pretty convincingly that Britain consistently ran huge trade deficits with other industrializing regions, Europe, the United States.
They were buying more from them than they were selling.
Yes, significantly more. So how did they balance their books? How did they afford to also export capital to those same regions?
The colonial surpluses.
Exactly. It was the massive and growing trade surpluses Britain generated with its tropical colonies, and India was by far the largest contributor that allowed Britain to offset those deficits elsewhere.
So India's surplus balanced Britain's deficit with, say, America.
Precisely. One historian, S.B. Saul, calculated that India effectively financed more than 2/5 of Britain's total deficits on its current account globally.
More than 2/5. That's an astonishing figure.
It really is. And it fundamentally challenges that conventional understanding that often just looks at Britain's trade with Europe or the U.S. and maybe mentions investment income, but completely ignores these massive tax-financed transfers from the colonies.
Right. It paints Britain's global financial position in a very different light.
It does, because these weren't just natural trade surpluses Britain happened to have with India. They were, in many ways, managed surpluses.
Managed? How so?
Well, India was a captive market, often forced to accept British exports even if cheaper alternatives existed. But more importantly, Britain had complete control over India's foreign exchange earnings from its trade with the rest of the world. Through those council bills and the Annex II charges we talked about, they effectively diverted all those earnings to London.
So Britain controlled both sides of the equation in a way.
They did, and this became even more critical later in the 19th century when Britain's own industrial dominance started to fade a bit, facing competition from Germany and the U.S.
How did India help then?
In a couple of key ways. Firstly, the re-export of Indian tropical goods became important again, just as it had been earlier. Secondly, and perhaps more crucially, as other countries started putting up tariff barriers against British goods.
Protectionism.
India remained a relatively open market for Britain, and India's exports to other countries faced fewer barriers. Britain could use India's trade surpluses, earned with the rest of the world and funneled through London, to settle its own international accounts, maintain its capital exports, and keep its own markets relatively open.
So India basically allowed Britain to sustain its commitment to free trade and the gold standard, even when its own industries were less competitive.
That's a major part of the argument, yes. It propped up Britain's global economic position. Our source material even connects this to Kindleberger's famous argument about the role of a global hegemon.
Right, Kindleberger's idea that a stable world capitalist system needs a leading power to keep markets open and provide capital.
Exactly. And the argument here is that the continuous massive flow of resources from India essentially enabled Britain to fulfill that hegemonic role for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It underpinned the stability of the gold standard, despite Britain's relatively modest gold reserves compared to the scale of its global transactions. The drain wasn't peripheral, it was central.
It really shifts the perspective on that whole period. Now, trying to actually put a number on this drain, quantify it over centuries, that must have been incredibly challenging. What were the main difficulties with the historical data?
Oh, immense challenges. Colonial-era economic data is notoriously tricky. One major issue was the way gold flows were recorded.
Gold?
Yes. The records often didn't clearly distinguish between commodity gold, Gold imported for making jewelry, for industrial uses, maybe even small-scale hoarding, and financial gold, which was gold held by the government or banks as a monetary reserve asset.
And why is that distinction important for measuring the drain?
Because early attempts to estimate the drain often just looked at the merchandise trade surplus goods exported minus goods imported. But that ignores services, and crucially, it ignores these gold flows. If India was importing commodity gold, that had to be paid for, reducing the actual surplus available to be drained. If financial gold was moving, that reflected capital flows or reserve adjustments, not commodity trade.
So just looking at the merchandise surplus gives a skewed picture.
A very skewed picture. In fact, for long periods, India was a net importer of gold. Colonial administrators and even some later historians sometimes pointed to this and said, see, Indians were just hoarding gold, that's where the wealth went.
But that wasn't the whole story.
Not at all. As Dadabhai Naoroji himself argued way back then, a lot of that imported gold served essential monetary functions within India.
Like coinage.
Yes, coinage, facilitating payments in a vast economy with an underdeveloped banking system, maybe some level of household saving and a tangible asset. It wasn't just unproductive hoarding.
The research then gets into more detailed estimates of these gold flows over time, right? Using this methodology.
It does. There's a table looking at the period from 1861 to 1919. It shows that while India imported significant commodity gold for much of the late 19th century, that trend actually reverses around 1877. India starts becoming a net exporter of commodity gold, or at least imports less. This coincides with increased imports of financial gold, likely linked to setting up the gold exchange standard.
Okay, and the rupee depreciation we talked about earlier fits in here too.
Yes, the depreciation in the 1880s and 90s technically increased India's commodity trade surplus when measured in rupees, but it also massively increased its sterling debt burden because of those rising abnormal invisible charges, NX2.
So more surplus generated, but even more debt imposed.
Pretty much. And financial gold imports continued into the early 20th century, adding further to India's financial obligations. There were also questionable practices around the management of the Gold Standard Reserve, which was held in London and often used in ways that seemed to benefit Britain's financial stability more than India's currency stability.
It sounds like every aspect of the financial system was geared towards facilitating this outward flow. What happened during the interwar years between World War I and II? Did the system change again?
It did become more complex. The use of council bills became erratic and was eventually phased out, replaced by more direct sterling transactions between London and India.
Why did it change?
Partly due to fluctuations in trade, India's export surpluses actually surged right after WWI, making council bills less necessary to drain them, but then turned into deficits during the Great Depression in the 1930s.
So how was the drain estimated for that period without the council bill proxy?
Researchers had to rely more directly on analyzing the treasure data, the recorded flows of actual gold and silver, trying to distinguish commodity from financial flows based on the economic context.
And what did that analysis show for the interwar years?
One of the most striking findings is the massive outflow of financial gold from India, particularly during the Depression years of the early 1930s. Huge quantities of gold left the country.
Right. And sometimes you hear that presented almost as a positive thing for India, like it helps stabilize its balance of payments or something.
That's a common narrative, yes. But the research we're discussing offers a starkly different interpretation. That while this gold outflow did happen, it only partially offset India's current account deficit, which had actually widened significantly during the Depression. India remained a net borrower overall.
So it wasn't India achieving some kind of financial strength.
Far from it. And crucially, much of this gold wasn't coming from government reserves initially. It was distress gold.
Distress
gold sold off by impoverished farmers and households, their meager life savings, often forced out of their hands by collapsing agricultural prices and the need to pay fixed land taxes and debts in cash.
So it's extracted from the most vulnerable.
Exactly. And where did this gold go? Primarily to Britain. Far from being a period of genuine financial decolonization for India, as some argue, these interwar years saw a continued substantial drain of wealth. Patnaik estimates it was around 3% of India's national income annually during this period.
3% annually, even during the Depression.
Yes. And this outflow of gold from India played an absolutely crucial role in helping Britain recover from the Great Depression and stabilize the pound after it went off the gold standard. India's distress bailed out Britain, in effect.
That puts a very different spin on the economic history of the 1930s.
It certainly does.
So after digging through all these mechanisms, these different periods, when researchers try to add it all up, the total drain from, say, 1765 to 1938, what kind of final figures did they arrive at? We hinted at it earlier.
The figures are, frankly, mind-boggling. As you mentioned, estimates vary based on the exact time period and the assumptions used for compounding the value over time.
Compounding is key, right? Because a pound drained in 1800 is worth much more today.
Absolutely. Using fairly conservative interest rates, research suggests the present-day value, as of around 2017, of the total drain from 1765 to 1938 could be somewhere in the region of $45 trillion.
$45 trillion.
Trillion, yes.
Well,
other calculations looking just at the period up to 1900 suggest figures potentially as high as $65 trillion.
that's almost incomprehensible. Multiple times the current annual GDP of the UK, or India for that matter.
It's astronomical.
Yeah.
And it's really important, as Patnaik stresses, to remember these are likely underestimates.
Underestimates.
And on several reasons. The interest rates used for compounding are often conservative, perhaps lower than actual long-term returns on capital. They generally don't fully capture the deflationary impact the drain had on India's own economy, the lost growth potential. They don't fully account for undervalued resources or unfair trade terms. So the true economic cost to India was probably even higher.
So while talking about reparations on that kind of scale might seem politically or practically unrealistic today.
Perhaps. But as the source material concludes, the very act of estimating this drain, of quantifying it based on rigorous economic methodology, provides critical, concrete evidence. It makes the scale of colonial exploitation undeniable.
It moves it beyond just a vague sense of injustice to something quantifiable.
Precisely. Professor Patnaik's work, in particular, makes the whole concept of imperialism tangible, an integral part of the economic reality. It demonstrates its central role, not just as a political phenomenon, but as a key mechanism in the formation and the global spread of capitalism itself.
So it's not just history. It's fundamental to understanding the system we have today.
Absolutely. It has enduring relevance for understanding contemporary global economic inequalities, north-south divides, the persistent challenges faced by many developing nations, and maybe even the kinds of economic policies often prescribed to them today.
Right. So I think the key takeaway from this deep dive is pretty clear. These colonial transfers, this drain of wealth from India, weren't just some minor side effect of British rule.
Not at all.
They were a fundamental structural mechanism that profoundly shaped the development of global capitalism. It had deep, lasting, and often severely underestimated consequences for both India and for Britain's rise.
And this really leads to a crucial question, something for you, the listener, to consider. Given the sheer magnitude of these historical transfers that we've discussed, how might they, consciously or unconsciously, continue to influence global economic inequalities, trade relationships, and development paths even in our world today?
That's a powerful question. And maybe another thought. If that traditional story, the one about Britain's purely self-driven industrial revolution, is shown to be incomplete, even misleading, what other historical events, what other established narratives about economic development and global relationships might also need a critical reevaluation through this kind of lens?
Definitely food for thought.
Absolutely. We really encourage you to explore this further if you're interested. Look into the work of Utsa Patnaik, revisit the original drain of wealth debates, and just delve deeper into the broader history of colonialism and its complex, long-lasting economic legacies.
You might find, as we often do in these deep dives, that the story of economic progress, how wealth is created and distributed, is often far more complex.
And sometimes, yes, far more extractive
than the standard narratives might lead us to believe.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Stay tuned for more.